Whitney Tilson, founder and CEO of newsletter publisher Empire Financial Research, also a former hedge fund manager and the author of multiple books, including your newest, The Art of Playing Defense, How to Get Ahead by Not Falling Behind. It is so great to have you on the show and great to see you again. Welcome, Whitney.
Thanks, Julia. Good to see you, and look forward to our talk.
Me too. And we've known each other for probably close to a decade at this point. And I have this question for you that I've kind of always wanted to ask you, and I never have. And so maybe you'll be revisiting a bit of your childhood. And the question for you, Whitney, is did you eat the marshmallow?
Yeah, that's funny. They never tell you. So you're referring, of course, to the famous Marshmallow Experiment that was done back in the early 70s by Stanford University professor Walter Mischel, and who published a book a few years ago called the Marshmallow Experiment. And basically they took 600 6-year-olds, and my dad was a graduate student at Stanford at the time, and so I have no idea how it happened, but I happened to be one of the students that they tested. And they put us in a room and observed us through a one-way mirror, and they put a marshmallow in front of us, a treat, and they said, but if you wait, we'll give you another marshmallow in 5 or 10 minutes. And basically, long story short, the kids who exercised the self-control to wait and not eat that marshmallow had massively better life outcomes, not slightly better, massively better, in turn, 200 points higher SAT scores, likelihood of graduating from high school and college, lifetime incomes, intact marriages, whether you got in trouble with the justice system, you name it. And so it's interesting. There's been some recent research which has cast some doubt on this, and whether it was more tracking whether you came from an intact family or a high income, well-educated parents, that kind of thing, and that correlated with whether you had the self-control to eat the marshmallow or not. And that obviously correlates very highly with life outcomes. But it was an interesting study. It's one of my few claims to fame that I was one of those kids. But they've been tracking me for 50 years since then. I'm now 56 years old. And tracking my entire life. And not only that, I'd say 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, they sent a whole team of people out here and did a whole series of tests in person with not only me, but my oldest child, to see whether it was hereditary, and whether the adults now who didn't eat the marshmallow as kids, whether their kids also exercise self-control. And so I asked, it's now a chocolate chip cookie. And so I asked my oldest daughter, who maybe was 12 at the time, did you eat the cookie? How long were you willing? And she's like, of course not. And she's a prototypical first child, very disciplined, dutiful, driven, successful, whatever. Fortunately, I have 3 daughters who I would all characterize the same way, but first children in particular tend to be like that. And so I asked, well, how long would you have waited? And she snorted and said, forever. Right? She understood that this was a test, and to pass the test, you don't eat the cookie. And so she would have never eaten the cookie.
Right. But when you're 6, maybe it's a little different.
Right. She was a little older. And by the way, I met Walter Mischel once. He passed away a couple years ago, but I'd say 10 years ago. He was at Columbia, and I reached out to him, and he's always tickled to hear from one of the kids he tested. This was now 40 years after the fact. And I went over and sat in his apartment, and he was a lovely guy, and chatted and all. And I asked him, have you ever told any of the 600 people? And he said, no, we can't tell them because it might bias their answers as we continue to test them throughout their life. But he did confess that he did tell one guy who just had to know, who was on his deathbed. And so Professor Mischel told him.
I think it's safe to assume, though, that you didn't eat the marshmallow.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was, given my life outcomes are extremely highly correlated with those who didn't eat the marshmallow. I would guess so. The only, if I did eat the marshmallow, there's a very simple explanation for it, though, is that I know you'll find this hard to believe, Julia, but I was a very hyperactive ADHD kid,
Really?
which is sort of how I am as an adult too. But it's possible that that hyperactivity or something might have taken over for a moment, and I snarfled the marshmallow, but I would suspect not.
Mhm. You have an interesting background. I read your book, The Art of Playing Defense, and we'll definitely dive into it because it is not your typical, it's not even your typical life advice book, and it's certainly not an investing book, though I would argue it is great for anyone in any field, including folks who want to get into investing. But I want to kind of revisit a bit about your background. You grew up, some of your childhood was spent in Africa, and talk to me about your background and how you even got interested in pursuing a career in finance.
Right. Well, I have one of the most unusual backgrounds for someone who ends up in finance. In that my parents were the third couple to meet and marry in the Peace Corps in 1962. They had left the Peace Corps, and I was born in 1966. But they have remained, for most of their careers, remained in the field of international development. My dad has a doctorate in education at Stanford. That's when I lived out there as a kid. But his specialty is educational projects in third world countries. So I spent more than half my childhood, 3 years in Tanzania, ages 2 to 5. That's where I first went to school. I was the only white kid in a classroom of Tanzanian farmers' children mostly. And my parents told me I used to come home crying because I had this horrible straight white hair and I wanted curly black hair like all the other kids. And my parents dressed me in these awful sneakers, whereas the other children had shiny black shoes. And there are funny pictures of me of where I had a hoe over my head, digging dirt in the yard because I wanted to be a farmer like all the other children. So that may have, influenced me in a number of ways, given me an appreciation, certainly later in life, for the incredible privileges and good fortune I've had to be born to two of the greatest parents anyone could ever ask for. But then after we moved back, my dad was working on his PhD at Stanford, ages 5 to 8. Then we moved down to a project. He was working on a radio mathematics project in Nicaragua back under the dictator Somoza before the Sandinistas took over. So it was a relatively quiet period there from 74 to 77, ages 8 to 11, I guess. And then my dad hadn't finished his PhD, so we moved back to Stanford for a year. And then my dad took a job as dean of dean of faculty at Northfield Mount Herman School in Western Massachusetts, about 2 hours west of Boston, which is where. So I went. My last year of public school was in a little brick schoolhouse in Northfield, Massachusetts, little town of 3,000 people. But then my parents, much to my chagrin, sent me off to an all-boys boarding school, but I was a day student called Eaglebrook. And I had to commute 45 minutes each way. And I was very upset because I was starting to develop an interest in girls, and there were no girls at this school. And also, I had a lot of friends who were all going off to the local high school and junior high. And, I had to go off to this horrible private school, but it really put me on a totally different educational trajectory. My parents sacrificed a lot to give me the very best educational opportunities, which is, really defined the trajectory of my life. So I went to Eaglebrook for a couple of years, then was a fac brat at Northfield Mount Herman for 4 years. And then moved to Boston for Harvard, 2 years working at Boston Consulting Group. And my first job out of college was actually helping Wendy Kopp start Teach for America.
That's right.
So so that's sort of, I've gone back and forth in the nonprofit sector and the for-profit sector. I got the do-gooder gene from my parents. So did a couple years at BCG, went to Harvard Business School for a couple years, met and married my wife, met her when Bill Ackman and I crashed the Harvard Law School orientation booze cruise at Boston Harbor. And she and Bill had gone to Hebrew school together when they were kids. And she recognized him and came up and started talking to him. And I elbowed my way into the conversation, and the rest is history. But I always joke to her that she married the wrong hedgie. And she laughs and she says, "Oh my God, I could never be married to Bill. Bill's one of our closest friends." But Susan's more of a type B personality and I'm more of a type A personality, but we're not so different, right? Bill is like, if you Google type A personality, I'm sure he's like, his picture pops up, right? He takes it to an extreme, far more than me. And I say that with love. So moved down to New York following Susan, who finished law school a year ahead of business, a year before I finished business school, and spent 5 years after business school running a nonprofit organization that I had started with Michael Porter while at HBS, called the Initiative for a Competitive Inner City. And then to your question, how did I, with this background, at this point in my life, after business school, approaching age 30, I had never owned a stock in my life. When I got the Wall Street Journal, I used to throw away the money and investing section. I was super interested in business, fancied myself being an entrepreneur, both in the for-profit and nonprofit sectors, and in fact had already been, helped start Teach for America, and then was the executive director and co-founder of the Initiative for a Competitive Inner City. And so the answer is necessity is the mother of invention. My entire life, basically, I'd either had no money or had been in debt. I took on debt to go to Harvard Business School, but fortunately married a lawyer. She had a good income. We lived in her grandparents' apartment. So even though I was earning 75 grand a year, I think I was the lowest paid Harvard Business School graduate from my class of 1994 for the subsequent 5 years, because I just had a fixed $75,000 salary. I remember, in fact, going back to my fifth reunion, and they had done a survey of the 800 of us, and they asked, "How much money have you earned in the past 5 years since you graduated?" And they showed a bell curve of the answers. And if I looked closely, the very left tail was me. I was that data point. I was 800th out of 800 in terms of my earnings after Harvard Business School, because I ran a nonprofit, and had a low salary, no bonus. But it was a great period. Working with Michael Porter was a privilege. I learned a lot from him. So again, how do you get from this to starting a hedge fund the following year? And the answer is despite my low income, we had very low costs. Our first child didn't come along till 1996, and then 99 and 02. But so we had the best kind of rent control, that being family rent control. We didn't spend much money, and my wife had a good income as a corporate lawyer. And so we saved. And so I paid off my business school debt. And then lo and behold, there was $10,000 in our checking account, I noticed one day. And I'd never had 10,000 in my checking account. So I was thinking to myself, well, what do I do? What should I do with this? So I called up my friend Bill Ackman, who was one of the few people at the time. Like, everybody from HBS now goes into hedge funds. They either go into hedge funds or venture capital, right?
Yeah.
And the real losers go into iBanking consulting, right? Which didn't used to be the case back 30 years ago in my day. Everyone went into iBanking consulting, and nobody had even really heard of hedge funds back at the time. But Bill was a pioneer in the space. He graduated 2 years ahead of me in 1992. He was a year ahead of me in college, 2 years ahead of me in business school. And he had started this hedge fund called Gotham Partners and had grown it from launching at 3 million. He was up to 500 million, and he was, teaming up with Leucadia to make a bid for Rockefeller Center, and he was already making a name for himself. So I remember I called Bill up. I said, "Bill, I've got $10,000. I want to invest it." And keep in mind, this was the late 90s. Stocks were ripping. It was the beginnings of the internet bubble. And so it was exciting. And it was the early days of the internet, and, the Motley Fool website, and people were pumping stocks on the message boards, just like they are today. These people on Reddit today think they've discovered something new, pumping GameStop and Bed Bath and Beyond. This is the oldest story. And it was happening online back in the late 90s. So I sort of got sucked into that. And so Bill, I remember his exact words when I said, I need to learn about investing and I want to invest this $10,000 I have. What should I do? And his exact words were, "Read everything Warren Buffett's ever written, and you can stop there." And
Wow.
those were pretty smart words. So I'd heard of this guy, Buffett, but again, I'd never owned a stock, didn't really know much about him. But I managed to track down some of his annual letters and started reading. And actually, in 1999, I think it was, maybe even 98, I went out to my first Berkshire annual meeting. And basically, given I come from a penny pinching family, my mom loves nothing more than clipping coupons and going to the supermarket and then coming home and boasting about how much money she saved, right? My parents to this day can squeeze a dollar till it screams. And so the idea of buying dollar bills for 50 cents, which is fundamentally what Warren Buffett talks about, what value investing is about, resonated with me. And so I started investing in a few stocks, and not because I was any great stock picker actually, but because stocks were just going up. It was a bull market. I started making money, and for a guy for whom $10,000 was like a fortune, it was the most money I'd ever had in my life. I remember putting $20,000 of my wife's IRA at her law firm into AOL because I was a user and an early user back at Harvard Business School. They gave us those little discs that were everywhere back in the
Yeah.
90s. And that was my very first email address, wrtilson at AOL.com, that I used for years. And so I knew the company and I thought it had good growth prospects. And lots of people were talking about it because I was sort of a clueless fool at the time. So I bought AOL stock in 1998. Within 1 year, that $20,000 had turned into $120,000. It was up 6x. And I thought two things. One, that I died and gone to heaven. I just made 100 grand and didn't lift a finger. And that's a lot of money at any point in time. But back then, it was like unimaginable. My mind was just exploding, right? But secondly, I thought I was God's gift to investing. I mean, what a genius I was. And back then, keep in mind, it was the tech stocks that were ripping. So Warren Buffett and Bill Ackman, well, they were doing okay, but they weren't making 6 times their money in a year. So I thought, well, look at me. And so that was the mindset with which I launched my own little hedge fund with $1 million on a rickety IKEA desk in the corner of our bedroom, and a laptop. That was it. And Bill gave me, I don't know, $100,000. My parents and my in-laws and I each chipped in 100 or 200 or something. Bill's dad gave me a little bit of money. A couple of my friends from business school, threw in 10 grand or 50 grand, whatever. And you add it all up, it was 15 investors, and I had $1 million to start with. And I had absolutely no business starting my own hedge fund. I never worked a day in the financial industry, much less at a hedge fund or something. I look back and shudder to think what a clueless fool of an investor I was. But I will give myself credit for at least being a fast learner. And after I started this little hedge fund, I started paying more attention to Bill, who was preaching value investing and buying high quality businesses and avoiding internet stocks. And then I stumbled into Joel Greenblatt's class at Columbia Business School. And he's a legendary sort of special situation value investor. And he let me sit in on the back of his class as he was teaching MBA students at Columbia in the spring of 2000, right as the internet bubble was peaking. And so somehow that got through my thick skull. And the fact I was making all this money on my tech stocks, and I got out of my tech stocks and started buying Berkshire Hathaway and stuff like that in the nick of time. And so that was sort of how I made the pivot from being a nonprofit, mostly a nonprofit entrepreneur, into running a hedge fund.
Yeah. There's what I love about this podcast? You can answer as long as you want. I don't mind because I enjoy listening to the stories. And so that's one of the things.
And I tend to be long-winded, so
I don't mind. I always
good,
let my
right?
guests talk uninterrupted. I think I talk 10% of the time on average and let the guests have 90, which is great. Okay, so there's a lot.
By the way, speaking of which, in life, one of the things I have learned is to do the opposite, which is if you want people to like you, if you want to have strong relationships and all, the more you let them talk and ask questions
Yeah,
about them and so forth, the more interesting and likable they will find you.
very true.
And it doesn't come naturally to me. Naturally, I'm a narcissist blabbermouth, right? That's the story of my youth. Um, but as I've matured, and my wife has had an influence on me, as Buffett and Munger have had an influence on me. And I still remember reading Dale Carnegie's book. I'm spacing the name of it right now. I'm having so
Oh,
many
how to win
senior
friends
moments.
and influence
How to Win
people.
Friends and
Yeah.
Influence People.
Yeah, which
Thank
is
you.
one of those Buffett recommendations as well.
Exactly. I think
Yeah.
he may have been the one who recommended it. It's, so I don't know, sold 100 million copies since it was first published, 100 years ago or so. But I can save all your listeners the time of reading the book. It's very simple. Number one, no one gives a crap about you. Number two, they only care about themselves. Therefore, number three is, if you want people to like you, is show genuine interest in them and don't talk about yourself. Um, and so, and it's sort of funny how like that book and those three little blurbs changed my life. Like, it opened my eyes, and I write about it in The Art of Playing Defense.
You
It's
do,
one of
yeah.
my main pieces. It's one of my, I don't know, hundreds of pieces of advice, that I try and impart in my book, which I wrote for my three daughters who are ages 26, 23, and 20 now. But the book was mainly, I just sort of felt like, I've gone through life, gotten a lot of scars on my back and a lot of lumps, and learned a lot of lessons the hard way. And I figure I should try and impart the most important lessons I've learned over the years to my daughters. And my wife has a wonderful, deep connection with my daughter. She talks to them on the phone every day or whatever. And I envy that relationship. I wish, I don't know whether, mothers and daughters just generally connect better like that, right? Or maybe it's me, and I just haven't made enough of an effort. But for whatever reason, I actually thought the best way I could impart my wisdom to my daughters was to write a book. And so I wrote it for them. And if nobody else in the world reads it, I don't care. But I'm glad to see that, other people, it certainly has not been a bestseller. I give it away for free to anybody who wants it. But I get nice feedback from it.
Yeah, you certainly do. Including if folks go check out your latest newsletter today, they'll see it was a military, someone in the Air Force, I think, was
Yeah,
giving it to
he
their
flew
cadets.
F-16s for the Air Force. He's now a United pilot, but he
Yeah.
mentors cadets at the Air Force Academy. And a book about Charlie Munger, and my book, he told me last night when we got together for drinks in New York. I love sort of meeting my longtime readers. He's been reading my stuff for like 20 years, and happened to have a layover in New York and said, "Hey, I'm a fan. You want to get together?" And I don't often have time for it, but I always enjoy it when I can find the time. And he's a great guy, and he really flattered me when he said my book is one of the two books that he recommends that his cadets read.
Yeah. Well, speaking of being like a father, and you mentioned you have three daughters. In your book, like, this was something that was interesting. I'm not a parent yet. Hopefully one day soon. You talk about the importance of playing sports with your daughters, and you were very active in terms of like the weekends. I think it was like the Whitney Olympic. What did you call
Daddy
it?
Olympics.
The Daddy
Yes,
Olympics.
every weekend in Central Park.
Talk to me about the importance of that involvement in your daughters' lives, and why that was so critical, like the athleticism part of it, doing sports together.
I will say my wife, like from the day she was born, I think has the mothering, nurturing gene, and she deserves the lion's share of the credit for raising our daughters, both the time invested, but the impact she's had on them. And knock on wood, they're all just really thriving, and I'm super proud of them and all. But I at least attempted to read some of the literature. A really impactful book was called The Price of Privilege. and it's a shrink who works with teenagers who grow up in basically top 1% households. And I live on the Upper East Side of New York, which is the wealthiest census tract in the United States. My daughters, for K through 12, attended a very expensive elite private all-girls school and all. And it's absolutely hilarious by any US or global standard. My wife and I are very comfortable, easily in the top 1%, right? In the United States, and top 1/10 of 1% in the world. We are comfortable, but my daughters sort of think we're poor because their friends are flying around in private jets and have $70 million homes in the Hamptons, which we do not have that kind of money, right? Our apartment, is a very nice apartment right across the street from Central Park on Fifth Avenue, is very nice, but it's very modest. It's below average, among their friend group. So you would think that children growing up amidst just unimaginable privilege and wealth would be all thriving, and because they don't have a wanter in the world, right? And the answer is that no, these kids are suffering from anxiety, depression, suicide attempts. Fortunately, horrifically, a few successful. Eating disorders, what there's a phenomenon basically called failure to launch, which is I have many friends who have kids who are graduating from college, and good colleges, and they've gone to elite private schools and good colleges, and I don't know, they're bagging groceries at Whole Foods or whatever. Like they just they just aren't on a career track, aren't getting good training, whatever, right? So I look at this, and so again, I'm not asking anyone to cry a river for wealthy families and privileged kids, but just pointing out that my job and my wife's job, parenting children growing up in this environment, is there's still a lot of challenges. And this is the context in which I'm giving you a long-winded answer to understand the question: why was it important to me to raise athletic daughters? And there were two studies that I've never been able to find again, but I remember them well. Number one was a study that showed that girls that played varsity sports in high school were much less likely to get derailed in the ways that high school girls can get derailed. Eating disorders, anxiety and depression, cutting, promiscuity, etc. And of course, dropping out. And then there was a second study that asked 12-year-old girls a super simple question: do you like yourself? And it's hard to think of a more fundamental question of any human being, right? Do you like yourself? And it turns out 80%, I'm sort of making up numbers here because I probably read this 20 years ago and I've never been able to find the actual study, but 80% of girls said yes at age 12. By age 14, that had crashed to 30%. Only 30% of 14-year-old girls in the United States answered yes to do you like yourself. So what the heck happened? And the answer is they hit puberty. They started, when you start to enter adulthood and you get bombarded with all the advertising and the images of perfection, of beauty, which is
Social
associated with,
media.
yeah. And keep in mind, this study was even pre-social media.
Yeah.
Like now it's on steroids. The rate of anxiety, depression, suicide attempts among teenagers really since the advent of the iPhone, because that's when social media, the Instagram, everybody leading perfect lives and airbrushing their pictures so they have perfect bodies, perfect clothing, perfect lives, perfect vacations. It's incredibly damaging and destructive, particularly to impressionable teenagers and especially girls who are judged much more so about their appearance and all. And I know you've been, you've been you were a beauty contestant and so forth. And so I'm sure you could,
like
you,
10
you
years ago.
yeah, but I can imagine you could speak volumes about this,
Yeah.
but I've certainly observed it. Those I wanted my daughters. So basically, what happens to girls from age 12 to 14 through their teenage years, and who knows how much longer, there's a dramatic drop in self-confidence and self-esteem. And so I wanted my girls to be physically strong, athletic, and just to, because I felt like that would help offset all this horrible messaging and all. And I wanted them to, be able to do a lot of pull-ups and be brave and fearless out there, going down the big slides and, whatever, just being sort of bold, et cetera, because I knew that there's nothing I could do. I mean, if anything, in this elite little Upper East Side bubble in which we live, these pressures around beauty and thinness and all are the absolute highest. So in particular, eating disorders, basically girls starving themselves to the point of being skeletons. I run in Central Park or bike in Central Park pretty much every day, and I it's a rare day when I'm out in the park for half an hour to an hour that I do not see at least one obviously anorexic woman out there generally jogging. And among my friends, I'm not sure if it's a majority, but it is a substantial number of my friends who have teenage daughters are dealing with eating disorders. Those daughters are suffering from eating disorders. I identified this as probably the number one risk factor that my daughters faced. So what do we do about it? One part of it certainly was starting at age 6 months. Every weekend, because I was traveling a lot. My wife was more the weekday parent, and I tried to make up for it by being the weekend parent and taking the girls and just giving my wife a break. And so I would just take them out in Central Park, after breakfast, and we would just go out for the day, basically. And I would bring one of these big double joggers, and I was on my rollerblades, so I'd be getting some exercise, pushing one, two, and by the time the third one came along, the oldest one could ride a bike. So she'd be riding a bike. I'd be pushing two of the kids in the jogger. And we had our favorite playgrounds with the biggest slides. We'd go to the merry-go-round, etc. But I also had soccer balls, a big old, plastic baseball bat, and I'd throw balls at them and they would hit them with the bat. Then we'd pull out the soccer balls and kick soccer balls around. I put them on rollerblades and scooters at an early age. At age 3, I took away the training wheels on their bikes. Most kids learn to ride bikes at age 6. I figured at age 3 I could teach them, and lo and behold, these tiny little children, would bike ride along on this tiny little bike, but with no training wheels. Developing balance and that kind of skill and coordination. And so all of my daughters played multiple varsity sports, starting in really 8th grade, not just at the end of high school, but early. They were all good athletes. And to this day, all of them have the habit, which I think is one of the most important habits to have, of just exercising every day. They go to the gym, they have their Peloton, not Peloton biking, but the Peloton actually has like a workout thing, just a video with someone, one of their trainers, who'll just give you a good workout in the gym. It's a habit that both my wife and I have as well. So they're sort of modeling that. And I think that's, they got through their teenage years like overflowing with self-confidence. And that's super important. And being good athletes, and being able to run, my oldest daughter ran the New York City Marathon, and all of my daughters have I think have very healthy body images and exercise regularly, and that was an important part of avoiding eating disorders. And the other part of it is at home, the word diet has never been mentioned in this house. My wife cooks healthy food. We keep healthy food in the house, but there's also some ice cream. There's frosted mini wheats. We all have our weaknesses. And so we just, ate healthily. And there was never, ever, ever, not once, any comment about what our daughters were eating, or, oh, you shouldn't eat so much of that, or why are you having a dish of ice cream at 10 p.m.? That's not healthy. It'll make you fat. Like those little comments can be absolute neutron bombs, and lead to eating disorders. So never any commenting about dieting or eating, and never ever, particularly the research shows that teenage girls are especially influenced by what their fathers say about women's appearances. So I was always super cognizant to never talk about any woman's appearance, or ever say, anything disparaging about someone who was overweight, or for example, only complimenting my wife. Oh, you look so beautiful tonight, when she's all dressed up, wearing a lot of makeup, right? If you only make that comment when your spouse is, all dressed up and wearing makeup, then you're almost, the absence of that comment the rest of the time also speaks volumes, right? So look, I don't, again, my wife deserves all the credit for how my girls have turned out, but at least by being deliberate and thinking about it, doing some reading, and being very, very careful in what in anything I said, even little things. At least I helped to avoid the landmines that could have led to eating disorders.
Yeah. Well, and it's a partnership. And like Warren Buffett often says, the most important decision you make is who you choose to be your life partner.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who you marry.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was super impactful to me. I still remember one of the Berkshire meetings 20 years ago or something. Someone asked him, about what's your best advice, and he said, the most important decision you will make is who you marry. The second most important decision you make in your life is what career you choose.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I can't even think of what's number three. Like those two basically determine all of your waking hours. If you pretty much all of your waking hours, you're either at home with your spouse or doing something with your spouse most of the time, or you're at work.
Well,
And you better like those two things, or you're gonna have a miserable life.
Maybe also I would add, and I'm not Warren Buffett, but if I were going to pick third, I'd say it would be your relationships and who you associate with. And, your friendship with Bill Ackman, for example, that's how you met your wife, had she not recognized him. And I don't know whose idea it was to go on that booze cruise, but good idea.
It was Bill's college roommate was starting Harvard Law School. Bill was starting Harvard Business School, and I was working at BCG in downtown Boston. So Bill's college roommate was sort of a nerdy guy and wanted a wingman for this social event. So he called up Bill and said, hey, Bill, will you come with me and be my wingman? And then Bill thought to call me because the booze cruise was leaving from Boston Harbor, which is only a few blocks from where I worked. And so the only two people of the 400 people on that boat who were not Harvard Law School first year students were Bill and me. Yeah. And we were there very explicitly. We were there to meet. Neither of us was dating anyone. And one of the things I talk about in my book is you want to fish in the right ponds when looking for a spouse. And I sort of give a couple funny examples of, the Navy SEAL who confessed that he had met the woman he later ended up marrying, working the pole at a strip club. And his friends told him that the moment you go out on deployment, she's going to start cheating with you with your best friend and empty your bank account. And he ruefully admitted that's exactly what happened. Okay. And then I contrasted that with another one of my friends, a well-known hedge fund guy whose name you would recognize, who met his wife when he was volunteering to guide a blind runner in the New York City Marathon. And she was also doing that. So if you think about, those would be two ponds in the opposite extreme. So I would argue going on the Harvard Law School orientation booze cruise is a good pond to fish in. And so Bill and I showed up to do some fishing. And what's really hilarious is that at the end of the evening, he had two women we were going to go out to pizza afterward. So he had met two women that he was bringing with him, one for each arm, I guess. And the one woman I had met was actually a old friend of Bill's. So I was sort of, and so lo and behold, Susan came out with us. So that was the two of us, and the three of them went out for pizza afterward.
Yeah. Well, it worked out, and also introducing you to the world of value investing.
You bet.
Charlie Munger,
You
Warren
bet.
Buffett.
You
Yes.
bet. I mean, so your point is very well taken. That is exactly what I would list as number three, which is, after who you marry is your other important relationships. So critically, another, by the way, I could give you Buffett and Munger quotes off the top of my head for hours, but because they've had such an impact on me. But a second very impactful one was um, at the annual meeting long ago is how do you define success? And Buffett said, if the people who should love you do love you. So the people who should love you are, in addition to your spouse, let's start with your spouse and your children, your parents, your siblings, and then your extended family and so forth. And then, do you have friends? I was just listening to a podcast just a couple of days ago, and it was the professor who's run one of the most famous studies ever, the Harvard study of the class of 1926. So they've been following a group of 260 men for basically a century. And there are so many important findings, but the most important, I would argue, in which I include in my book, is that the quality of your life, the single biggest determinant of the quality of your life and your happiness is your relationships. Do you have strong relationships? And one way of testing that is if you have an emergency in the middle of the night, who would you call? And an alarming number of people who live alone, they don't have a spouse, can't answer that question. There's nobody they can call. And this is indicative of an epidemic of loneliness,
Yeah.
not just in the United States, but across the world. It's happening in every country. And I would actually argue that social media is contributing to that, because it's turning what used to be, to have a relationship prior to social media, you used to actually have to do one of two things: either be with someone in person or call them on the phone. And those two ways of interacting with people tend to build relationships over time, right? But now you can just click like on somebody's post, or you can accept their Facebook friend request. But that's not a relationship. I have over 3,100 friends on Facebook, and so that's a mile wide and an inch deep. But those aren't the people who, if you have a crisis, you can call. And by the way, another fundamental test that really had an impact on me, and I forget where I read it or first heard it, is the simple question: how many people do you have in your life who would hide you? And this, of course, refers to Jews during the Holocaust. The ones who survived, if they didn't actually somehow escape to the United States or get out in time, the ones who survived in areas controlled by the Nazis, who were trying to kill all of them, of course, were ones where non-Jews risked their own lives to hide their Jewish friends. And that's so think about how many people do you have in your life who would risk their own life to hide you, to save your life? That's a pretty fundamental question. So the number, I would argue that the results of this Harvard study, et cetera, show that it's those kind of relationships and how many of those relationships you have in your life that will determine your success and happiness. So as Buffett correctly points out, the number one relationship, the person who you will spend the most time with over the rest of your life, is your spouse. That's most important. But then the sort of collection of, do you have strong relationships with your family, and do you have a strong friend group, is critically important. And I'll share with you the one takeaway from the YouTube video that I was just watching yesterday about this guy who's one of the professors who's run this Harvard study is if you want to improve the quality of your life, sit down and figure out, okay, how can I have more have deeper relationships with more people?
Mm.
Are there people in my friend or family group where there's something has impacted our relationship? Can I repair that and improve that and get it back to where it should be with a brother or a child, or where you're estranged? My grandfather didn't talk to his brother for the last 40 years of his life because they had some stupid argument. Like, that's just madness. And is there a way that you can you can turn a distant friend into a closer friend? The guy in the YouTube video actually had an interesting idea. He said, just think about somebody who you were thinking about, who you appreciate. They did something, they've had a positive impact on your life, and just send them a quick email or a text just saying, hey, I just want to let you know I really appreciate you, something like that. That's a small step toward creating a deeper relationship with someone. I tend to take it to an extreme. I invite all my friends to go skiing with me, all the adventures that I do. The more of my friends who come with me, the better. And, I sometimes send out a blast email saying, hey, I'm skiing at Snowbird this weekend. This is what I did last weekend, on Saturday and Sunday. And lo and behold, an old friend who lives in Salt Lake City said, yeah, I'll come ski with you for 2 days. And he brought along two of his friends. And, the result is I now have dramatically deepened my relationship with someone who is more of an acquaintance, number one, but I have two new friends, his two friends that we skied together. And, I've added them to one of my email lists or something. So I tend to be pretty good at going through life, collecting friendships, and I do a lot of things to try and deepen relationships with people. So on that score, I do pretty well.
You are really good at that. And gosh, this conversation, it reminds me, I had Scott Galloway on the podcast. So when you talk about the loneliness epidemic, we talked
Yes.
about that, especially amongst men.
Yes, because men, yeah, Scott is a friend and one of my absolute favorite thinkers
Yeah,
and
he's
all,
amazing.
and his writing and thinking and what he's been preaching to young people and all, and the book he wrote. Can you remind me the name of it?
It's Adrift, America in 100
Yeah,
Charts. But he has
that's his new book,
Algebra of
which
Happiness.
actually I have here, and it's not on Audible. And I'm like, Scott, you're killing me. He's like,
Oh,
it
I
doesn't
have it
work on
too.
Audible because the book is,
You have to have
full
the
of
charts.
full of charts and
Well, no,
all.
he does actually read it on Audible. So I have the
Oh,
audiobook
is it now on
version.
Audible?
Yeah,
Because
he
when it first
narrates
came
it.
out, I tried to order it on Audible. So thank you for
Yeah.
telling me that.
Yeah.
But he wrote a book, which I can look
Is it
up
the
here.
Algebra of Happiness?
Yes, thank you. The Algebra of Happiness, which is actually probably the most similar book that I'm aware of to my book, The Art of Playing Defense. And in fact, I quote him a couple times directly in my book, because he has been talking about this, how social media has had this destructive thing, the epidemic of loneliness, and how particularly men. He's written some beautiful stuff. I highly recommend signing up for your listeners. Definitely sign up for my free investing daily, which I always have personal stuff at the end of it. You can just go to empirefinancialresearch.com and type in your email to get that. But then go to just Google, I don't know what the website is, but Google Scott Galloway blog or something like
I
that.
think it's No Mercy, No Malice.
Yeah, No Mercy, No Malice is what he calls his blog. You can just sign up for it and get it sent to you. But, he was recently writing about, his college friends and how telling stories and how one of them committed suicide. And how Scott always feels like, could I have been a better friend to him and, whatever, but how others affected his life because he grew up sort of poor with a single mom, and how his friends in college influenced him. So the people you pick to surround yourself with and your friend group, second only to your spouse and family, are going to have the biggest influence on how you end up and how you end up living your life. Pick your friends carefully is certainly one of the big messages. But what got me thinking about Scott? What were we just talking about?
The loneliness epidemic, especially amongst men.
Yeah. I have a that is one of the my book, the Art of Playing Defense, is sort of a funny name for like a how to be successful book. And the reason I wrote it this way is because I was writing a book for my daughters on how to achieve success and happiness. And as I was writing it, I sort of lost momentum and I was sort of bored. And for like a year, I didn't write anything. And I realized eventually why, because it's boring. There are thousands of books out there on how to be happy and successful. So what I did is I channeled my inner Charlie Munger, where Charlie Munger's always talking about calamities, and the 24 causes of human misjudgment is one of his favorite speeches. And he always says invert, always invert. And so what I instead said is what, and I had put together a presentation on the 5 calamities that can destroy your life and how to avoid them. And it was a PowerPoint presentation. And every time I gave it, it was, the audience was, I would get the best response from that. And I've got dozens of presentations, mostly on investing and short selling and behavioral finance or whatever. But this one, wow, I got a great response. So I was like, I should frame the book this way. So I inverted, and the book is structured around those 5 calamities. And so the overarching theme is the art of playing defense. In other words, if you want to be successful in life, don't think about how can I play better offense, right? How can I grab that brass ring or whatever? It's instead, obviously, you want to be working hard and building relationships and having integrity and doing all the right things. And I do include that in the book. But once you reach a certain level of success and comfort, your main objective should be not to lose it all and how not to have your life ruined, even if you're really successful. And so that's why I structure the book around these calamities. And one of the 5, the chapter is entitled Loneliness or Ruptured Relationships with a Loved One. So that's a big time calamity. Buffett and Munger are always talking about the billionaires that they know or observe who are 3 times divorced. Their spouses hate them, their children hate them. And, Munger he chuckles and tells the story about, he tells 2 somewhat related stories, but he's like, you don't want to be the guy who at your funeral, everybody's there. And the minister says, okay, does someone, want to come up and give a eulogy and say something nice? And nobody moves. And finally, and there's this uncomfortable silence. And finally, somebody says, well, his brother was worse. Okay. Oh. That's joke number 1, he tells. I'm trying to think of, I'm having another senior moment, but there's sort of another related joke about sort of at your funeral. You don't want to be that
make sure
guy.
That you're really dead.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. At your you probably remember it now better than I do. Whereas you don't want to be the guy who at your funeral everybody's there just to make sure you're dead. So he's joking, but he's sort of serious. You can have all the money in the world, but if everybody hates you and you have ruptured relationships, you're a failure. You're miserable.
Yeah. Well, for the folks watching and listening, you mentioned the calamities. That was one of the calamities. We've kind of talked about them throughout this. So I can list them here. You had 1, loss of reputation and or wealth. Calamity 2, we just mentioned, which is loneliness or suffering an impaired relationship with a loved one, a permanently impaired relationship, I should say. 3, a bad marriage, often ending in divorce, which we talked about. Of course, that's the most important decision you make, is who you choose to be your partner. Calamity 4, addiction and abuse. And calamity number 5, the death, serious injury, or illness of yourself or a loved one.
Yeah. By the way, on the marriage, that's my favorite chapter. So I always tell people, look, because basically it covers 100% of all human beings, which is the first part of the chapter is focused on finding the right person. My favorite part is the 12 questions to ask before you marry someone, which is really a collection of, 40 questions, structured into 12. And then the second half of the chapter is on how not to screw up your marriage. So the second half of the chapter basically says, as soon as you're married, throw the 12 questions away. You're now committed and you want to make this a success. And I'll tell you, I'd say 2/3 of the divorces I've observed among my friends and family, it wasn't a mistake on the way in. They married a good person. They had a happy marriage for a number of years, and then it went south and went bad, right? And 1/3 of the time, they just made a bad mistake as a young person and married someone they shouldn't have married, and the marriage was doomed. But that means 2/3 of the time it wasn't doomed. Marriages that went bad, right? And so if I were to summarize the 12 questions, the first question relates to is the person you're considering marrying a kind and good-hearted person? Would anyone say they had a mean bone in their body? How do they treat people beneath them, waiters, Uber drivers, that kind of thing? And a funny question, but I think there's a lot of truth to it, is do dogs and children like them? So that's all question one, goes to their heart, right? And then there's a whole series of questions about, if you weren't romantically involved, would you still be friends? Do they make you a better person? Do they have a purpose in life? Because I'm assuming my readers have a purpose in life. People with a purpose and who have some drive and whatever, you don't want to marry a lump. But a lot of basic questions. When you have kids, is one of you going to take time out of your career, and how are you going to share the child caring duties? Do you have similar views about money, and how frugal or how extravagant are you? Et cetera, et cetera. And then the last question is do you have a wild and passionate sex life? And I throw that in there, and I deliberately put it in last because a lot of young people seem to put it first. And so I know guys who are trapped in miserable marriages with young kids, so they feel like they can't get out, but they married someone who's just not a very nice person or whatever, but she was very hot and beautiful, and they had a great sex life. And young guys and young gals, I'm sure, tend to overweight that factor. So that's sort of a quick overview of some of the highlights of the 12 questions. But then it's like, okay, now you're married. I cannot think of the 2/3 of marriages that ended that were good to start, where they married a good person. I cannot think of a single one that ended suddenly. Okay. In other words, they didn't, go to jail. They didn't, cheat on their spouse on a trip to Vegas or something sudden. All of them went bad slowly, and there wasn't any one thing. It was a collection of things. And my one observation is it's very easy to get sloppy in how you treat someone if you live with them all the time, and to just have these annoying little habits and all. But if you keep these annoying little habits and don't deal with them, they could build up. It's here's the thing, Julia, you and I are friends, right?
Yes.
If I treated you badly and started being nasty and unpleasant to you, you just wouldn't be my friend anymore, right? You got lots of other friends, right? You just go away as a friend, right?
Yeah, there are lots of other people out there to be friends
Of
with.
course, of course. So you got to be careful how you treat your friends, or they won't be your friends for very much longer. But you can treat your spouse really, really crappy for a lot of years, and they're probably not going to divorce you. Okay, not immediately, right? So in other words, the fact that you're in a really committed relationship and you got kids and you have the security, which is a good thing generally, that they ain't going anywhere, and your marriage is intact and going to go on, right? That security is a good thing, but it can also lead to people getting sloppy. And so when I look at marriages where I've had sort of a front row seat because it's happened to a close friend or family member, it's sort of initial trigger points and points of irritation, which then aren't really addressed with. And it's like a burr under the saddle of a horse that rubs and rubs, and then it gets infected. and then it gets gangrenous, and then it kills the horse, right? Like these little things can cause little resentment that then cause the other person to behave a little badly toward you. And you sort of almost get this tit for tat behavior that can get you on a slow spiral downward. And it happens so slowly. It's like the old parable about the frog boiling, right?
Yep.
It can happen slowly. And unless and I'll tell you, writing this book and seeing this and trying to put it in writing to teach my daughters so that this doesn't happen to them has actually made my marriage better, because I come home when I was writing the book, and I would read part of a chapter, a page or two, to my wife about, you want to be careful about throwing your stinky clothes on the floor, or hogging the sheets at night, or leaving the toilet seat up, or, not if Susan does all the cooking, and if I don't say, thanks, that was a delicious meal, honey, thank you, or something, showing some appreciation for something she's done, right? If you just get sloppy and don't treat someone nicely, and do things that irritate them, it can really, over time, long periods of time. So I'll give you another one of the most impactful quotes I ever heard from Buffett. He said, the chains of habit are too light to be felt until they are too heavy to be broken. So if you just think about all the little habits about how you treat your spouse, how you, whether you exercise, whether you eat healthily or not, those little habits over the course of a day, a week, a month, a year, aren't likely to make any impact on your life, right? But over a long period of time, if you get into bad habits over a number of years, it's the only thing that matters. It'll be the 90% determinant of the trajectory of your life, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of the main message of the second half of my book, which is, be very conscious of your behavior toward your spouse. Don't take them for granted. And there will always be stresses in marriage. Marriages go up and down. My marriage, I would, on a scale of 1 to 10, it has ranged over 29 and a half years now, from a 6 to a 9.5. I'm pleased to say today I'd put it close to the high end of that range. But when I say that, I'll point to one, I would never say it's been a 10. I don't think that's very realistic. I don't think very many people have that, and it's just probably not going to happen. So that's okay. You just need to have it be north of an 8. That's a happy marriage, right?
Right.
Anytime you start to get it starts to trickle down to the 6 or a 7. Here's the thing. A lot of couples, and I noticed this until I started writing my book, I realized that, Susan and I weren't communicating on some of the things that I was doing that irritated the crap out of her, and some of the things she was doing that irritated the crap out of me. Right. And so I would come home and I'd read her things about this book, and she'd say, man, Whitney, you are the biggest hypocrite. Here you are talking about habits like, not leaving clothes on the floor and the toilet seat up. But that's exactly what you do. And it annoys me. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's right. She was right. And so I stopped doing it. But, it took me after 20, I was writing this book, I don't know, 3 years ago. So it was after 25 years of marriage, I was still doing these stupid little things. I'd gotten into bad habits that were irritating Susan and therefore affecting our relationship. So, the key is look, often it's external stressors. You have a kid with special needs, or who gets sick. You're an elderly parent, needs more care. One of you loses a job. One of you suffers an illness or an injury, right? These are things that have nothing to do with, your habits and how you treat each other. They're external stressors, and every human being and every couple has ups and downs in their life. And during those down periods, you got to be there for each other, but you got to understand that will put stress on your marriage for sure. And the key is if you get down to a 6 or a 7, you got to have a conversation, and you got to say, look, I feel like we're not in a great place right now. I feel like you're angry and upset with me, at least not, if not all the time, at least too often. And I've noticed that. And I feel the same way. I feel, angry and upset with you, and let's talk about it. And I don't want to be angry and upset with you ever, or certainly a lot less. So let's figure it out, because the marriages that end up ending, they started out as an 8 or a 9, and then they went to a 7, and then they went to a 6, and that was sort of the key point, because once you get under 6, your marriage is in trouble. So the key is, and my marriage has been at a 6 at times, and the key is can you recognize it, and then can you communicate, and so that you can jointly try and address it. Because the marriages that have ended, and it's always a train wreck, it's just a horrific train wreck. They didn't go from 8 to 2 overnight, or even over 1 or 2 or 3 years. They went from 8 to 2 over 5 to 10 years, if not 15 years. So they went slowly, 8, 7, 6, and then there was no intervention. So then it went 5, 4, 3, tick, tick, boom. That's what you got to avoid.
So we've talked about the a bad marriage, or that ending in divorce is one of the calamities. Another calamity that you talk about is death, serious injury, or illness of yourself or a loved one. And I imagine that also ties into the importance of risk management, probably a huge theme when you think about avoiding these calamities in life. Talk to me about that one.
Yeah, it's one I think about a lot, because I do a lot of dangerous things.
Yes, you do.
I have an adrenaline gene. Not, I wouldn't say an extreme one, but pretty high up there. I have no desire to free solo El Capitan, like Alex Honnold did in that movie, where one slip and you die. On the other hand, that movie inspired me to hire a guide and climb El Capitan over 4 days, up 3,000 feet of rock, dangling by a rope, 3,000 feet above the valley floor, sleeping 3 nights, in a portaledge on the face, which is not risk free. So this chapter doesn't say, hey, don't take any risks or whatever. In fact, I encourage people to do bold things, but think very carefully about how bold, and then think very carefully, okay, if I am going to get into mountaineering and rock climbing, which I have done, in addition to El Cap, I've climbed Mont Blanc, the Matterhorn, the Eiger, in the United States, just in the past couple of years, climbed Mount Whitney, Mount Shasta. I'm going to do the Grand Teton shortly. Anytime you're up there at high elevation, particularly when you're rock climbing or mountaineering, where you have lots of exposure, where an uncontrolled fall is fatal, you need to be thinking very carefully about risk. Not only risk of a fall, but actually the biggest risk is a rock fall, a rock coming down from above and hitting you in the head. You have done nothing wrong, and you're still dead, or a lightning strike hitting you. I have thought so carefully about these risks. But look, I realize 99% of your listeners aren't going to be climbing El Cap or any of these mountains I've just named. The point, though, here is to think about what the risks are and how do you mitigate them. In my case, I fortunately am wealthy enough to afford to hire a professional guide. And so the only time I am ever up there on a rock or a mountain is when I'm roped to one of the what's called an AFMGA certified. It's the highest level of international certification for any mountain or climbing guide. These guys are like the LeBron Jameses of mountaineering and climbing. And when I'm roped to them, our interests are highly aligned. If I fall, they're probably falling too. And so they keep me safe. And so that takes something that quite a few people die. Just Google Mont Blanc deaths, or Matterhorn deaths, or El Capitan deaths. And every year, a bunch of people are dying on these mountains. If you look closely, and I have looked closely, it's all because they were out there by themselves or with another inexperienced person. It almost never happens that anyone dies when they've hired a professional guide, because these guys are the best and they keep you safe. Other areas that I talk about in this chapter are car safety. I've had multiple friends be in serious car accidents, defined as car totaled and injuries to people in the car, including two friends who've lost college-age children who died in car accidents. So, I tell all my friends, I come from a family where we didn't own a new car for my entire life until I was out on my own after business school. And my wife and I bought a new car. But otherwise, my parents have only owned used cars because my dad's sort of mechanical and they're cheapskates. And I think that's a mistake today with the car safety that's out there to drive an old car. My friends' children who died in old cars that didn't have all the latest safety features. If for a cheapskate like me, I drive one of the world's safest cars, a Volvo, and a newer model. Even though normally, at one time I was driving a 10-year-old Volvo and then realized as I was doing research on safety features that the newer Volvos. So I spent a bunch of money just to buy a new version of the same car that I already had. And lo and behold, my wife fell asleep at the wheel a year later, went off the road, crashed in, car was totaled. Fortunately, she was completely unhurt, but it could have been a fatal accident had she gone down a ravine or gone head on into a tree, and been in an older car. That was a real lesson. And it's not just happened with that accident with my wife, but people very close to me. My first cousin, some of my closest friends have had accidents either themselves or their children, or in one case, my cousin, his nanny was driving a car, took a left-hand turn into oncoming traffic, and the car hit their car broadside. And two of his three children were sitting in the passenger side of the car, in the front and the back. One of his children got a concussion. Could have easily been a fatal accident, but thank goodness it was a BMW or something, a car with a really good structural passenger cage with side airbags. Otherwise, his kids would probably be dead. So that's a whole area. I talk a little bit about riding motorcycles and the dangers of that. The single most dangerous thing I do is, as soon as we finish this call, I'm going to hop on my bike and bike down to Midtown to an appointment. It is not as dangerous as mountain climbing per day or per hour, but I ride my bike in New York City on the streets of Manhattan, which is not a very bike friendly city, every day, whereas I climb mountains, 1 to 2 weeks a year. So cumulatively over the course of a year, Julia, you can refer back to this podcast in my eulogy. I confidently predict that if I die prematurely, it's not going to be from doing something crazy. It's just going to be riding bike in the city and I ran a red light or just got unlucky. A car ran a red light or I ran a red light, right? So what do I do to mitigate risk on my bike? I have invested, actually, I have it in my pocket right now. Those of you watching the video here, this is one of the 4 lights I have on my bike. Let's see if I can turn it on here. I am holding an incredibly bright blinking red light up right now for those of you listening to this. And this goes on. This is not some cheapo little battery powered thing. It's a $70 LED light with extremely high lumens that makes me extremely visible to the people behind me, the cars behind me. I have an equally bright white light on my handlebars going forward. And then on top of that, I wear a helmet. It's called a Lumos, Lumos. I highly recommend it, that has embedded blinking lights in the front and back. So basically, even during the daytime, not just at night, I have these lights on and blinking, and they make me highly visible. Another example is a few years ago, my bike was wearing out. The brakes weren't as good as they once were. And you know what? I said, I can't mess around with this. I went to the bike store, dropped $1,500 on a new street bike, which has hydraulic disc brakes. So now in an emergency stop situation, I can probably stop in half the distance as with my old bike. That half the distance could be the difference between getting run over by a bus or it very narrowly whizzing in front of me as I come to a stop, right? So again, even something very basic, everybody rides a bike at some point or another. Thinking very carefully about whether the bike itself is safe and in good condition and you can maneuver quickly and particularly stop quickly, and whether you're lit up like a Christmas tree so cars and pedestrians and other bikes and people can see you so you're highly visible. So again, investing a fair amount of money in taking something I do that I recognize as dangerous, and not stopping doing it, but taking steps and making investments to mitigate that risk. That's the
Yeah.
key.
Mitigating risk. Well, you are a lot braver than I am, Whitney, because I am the person who would like walk their bike to Central Park, not riding.
Yeah,
Uh,
I don't want to. I mean, you're super cautious. The one of the reasons I recognize this is that I'm always sort of in a hurry, and so
I
I
know that
I
about you.
I am a very skilled bike rider in that I can stop on a dime and I'm very aware of things around me. On the other hand, I am an aggressive rider as
Yeah.
well. I will admit to that. And probably the single biggest thing I could do to improve safety is to slow down. Come to a complete stop at all red lights and stop signs, etc. All right, that's my New Year's resolution, maybe.
Yeah. Well, be safe. And I don't want this to be your last podcast.
Yes.
I do want to talk about markets with you,
Mhm.
because I was actually looking back on an interview we did after you closed your hedge fund.
Yeah.
And I think at the time we were talking about it was like a complacent bull market at the time. And
Yeah.
that was probably 2017 when we had
Yeah.
that conversation. Now that we're into 2023, what's kind of your big picture take of the markets right now and your outlook?
Generally speaking, I'm actually reasonably bullish today. It was a dreadful year last year. Dow down almost 10, S&P down almost 20, Nasdaq down more than 30. I read somewhere that the average individual investor's portfolio, through November, the market was, I don't know, or maybe through October. So it may even be worse than this, but the average investor's portfolio is down 44%. So probably ended the year somewhere in the down 40 range, right? Because the average investor doesn't own the S&P 500. They own a mix of things, but generally smaller stocks, more aggressive stocks, probably own some cryptos, some SPACs, that were down 80%. And so the average investor did much worse than the indices. And so it's been carnage out there. But the more blood in the streets there is, the more bullish I get, of course. I've made my career on being willing to wade into buying in October 2002, in March 2009, in March 2020, the not generational, but decade bottoms of the market. And I don't claim to have perfect timing in each case, but pretty good timing. I didn't start buying too early. And so, where are we today? We're certainly nowhere near any of those three bottoms in terms of sentiment and valuations and things blown out. On the other hand, we're not in any economy threatening, calamities right now. Yes, the Fed has raised interest rates. That has certainly slowed down the economy. It's really slowed down the housing market, which is a big part of the economy. But none of the conditions are out there, I think, that lead me to think we're going to have some big economic contraction, recession, much less a depression. Banks are incredibly healthy. Lending standards have remained very tight since the global financial crisis. I tried to get a home equity. I didn't try. I applied for a home equity line of credit, and I have very good credit. I have no debt. I've got plenty of assets, good income, whatever. And they gave me a root canal to get $1 million HELOC on a $3 million apartment. I mean, I couldn't believe it, but it sure made me believe. I'm like, wow, if they're giving me this kind of root canal, there cannot be any fraud out there in the mortgage market, for example. So that was good. Unemployment is near all-time lows, and so that means, and wages are rising, particularly for people in the bottom half of the income distribution, which bodes well for consumer spending, which is 70% of GDP. So look, I'm certainly aware of all the gloom and doom stuff out there, and if Russia starts using nukes in Ukraine or China invades Taiwan, sort of all bets are off. But so there are always black swans out there. But by and large, I think the economy is actually doing reasonably well. And secondly, I think inflation was the big thing that was causing the Fed to raise rates and so forth. And I'm actually fairly convinced that inflation, the decline we've seen over the last few months, is going to continue. I don't think we get back down to 2% anytime soon, but I do think we get back to 4% in the first half of the year. And at that point, the Fed is definitely not tightening anymore, may even start easing a little bit. And that'll be good for, so the combination of the Fed no longer being a headwind. Keep in mind the normal direction for stocks is up. So after you've had a big drawdown, I think that's especially true after a bad year like last year. The inflation moving in the right direction, and unless corporate earnings take a bath, which I don't see happening, due to a big recession, that makes me, fairly constructive. I'm not sure we're going to have a melt up, but my best guess 2023 is the market's up 15 to 20%, which would be a very good solid year.
Mm-hmm. Like you mentioned, reasonably bullish. Let me ask you this, because I've had some folks in the value investing community on this pod. Even folks, some folks have said like they think that it's going to be a great environment for value investing, also stock picking coming back into favor. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean that's sort of a cliche, this is a stock picker's market. I mean there's some truth to it in that. Look, from the bottom in March of 2009 until the COVID crash, you had a bull market where basically it wasn't a stock picker's market. It was just a growth investor's market. It was just a be fully invested market. And basically the more risk you took, the more you were rewarded. Obviously, over that time period, if you bought Bitcoin, you make, the most risky asset I can imagine, you made 100 times your money probably in that time period, if not 1,000 times. But the most aggressive growth stocks, the kinds of stuff, things that Cathie Wood at ARK owns, that stuff sort of ran up the most. And, but that stuff has now also been clobbered the most in the past year. I would like to think that just good, solid value investing, sort of has its run, because it had a run for the first 10 years I was running a hedge fund after the collapse of the internet bubble, which was, a real growth stock Nifty 50 kind of bubble that took place over 10 years or so. You basically had sort of, from 99 into the global financial crisis, you had almost a decade-long run in which value stocks and long, short, traditional value investing really worked. It worked great for me. But then after that, you just sort of had this 10-year run where stock picking didn't matter much, and anything you shorted, you got killed on, and you just wanted the more, you're just rewarded for risk. I suspect we're probably, the cycle has turned again, and my guess is probably right. That good sound stock picking, that you're just not going to be able to throw darts and be rewarded, or just do aggressive foolish things and be rewarded. That said, if the Fed does stop tightening and starts easing, the most beaten down stuff probably will pop the most, right? So my general forecast of 15 to 20% S&P 500, in that environment, Berkshire Hathaway will probably do 20, 25%, it's a little bit undervalued, might do a little better than the market, but a good quality tech stock, the most beaten down would be Facebook, but a Netflix and Amazon are three of my favorites among the big tech stocks. I'd throw PayPal in there. My guess is those stocks go up 30 to 40%. Because they got hammered the most in the downturn. I mean, PayPal was down 80%, and it's still down not far from its lows. Meta went down 80% from like $1 trillion market cap, over $1 trillion, lost 80% of its market cap peak to trough, certainly more than 70%. It's had a rally, but it's still down probably 60% from its peak. So those were some pretty severe drawdowns of some pretty incredible businesses.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned just like some of these names. What are some of like the big higher conviction ideas that you have, or big themes that you're looking at right now?
Well, I always start out by just telling the average investor, the average person listening to this, shouldn't be picking stocks at all. Like my parents basically don't pick any stocks. I just have them in the S&P 500. I don't want the pressure and brain damage of picking stocks for my parents. That was stressful enough. when I was doing it as running a hedge fund. Managing anybody else's money is a stressful thing, especially during downtimes, of course. My sister, her 100% of her retirement account is just in the S&P 500. That's it. And that's all she's owned for like 20 years. And you know what? She's outperformed 99% of everybody just doing that. My first advice is, and by the way, in my investment newsletter business, we have a policy where I cannot own anything we recommend in our newsletters. And we have 7 different newsletters and dozens of stock recommendations. I can't own any of them. So I had to sell my Berkshire Hathaway when we launched my business, and we recommended Berkshire Hathaway.
You had to sell your Berkshire Hathaway?
I know, it kills me. But look, Berkshire's going to do a few points better than the S&P 500, but no, I'm not crying the fact that I just instead bought the S&P 500 index instead of Berkshire, right? I'll do fine, a couple points worse than Berkshire, but that's okay. So I'd start with the S&P 500. Then I'd put Berkshire Hathaway on it, which today is 12 or 13% undervalued. So I think you'll do a couple points better than the S&P. Owning Berkshire is very well diversified. And, so S&P 500 could be 50% of your portfolio. Berkshire might be 10 or 15%, right? But then nothing else would be bigger than 5%, right? Any individual stock. But, my 3 favorite tech stocks for a number of years now have been Amazon, Alphabet, and now Meta platforms. I always, of course, I think of it as Facebook. Look, you can do worse than Berkshire and those 3 tech giants and call it a day.
We talked about calamities in your book, but we haven't talked about calamities in markets and investing. What do you think are the calamities that investors should watch out for?
There are dozens and dozens of them, of course, but big picture, the surest way to get poor quickly is to try to get rich quickly. Okay, so investing and building wealth over time is something where you just need to get time working on your side and not blow up, not have any big blow-ups or big drawdowns. The math behind big drawdowns is devastating. If you take a lifetime in which you are trying to save and build wealth for a comfortable retirement, maybe an early retirement or something, means you can't have any zeros in there. You can never blow up and go to zero. And basically the only way that can happen is if you use margin. So basically never use margin, number one. Generally don't use options, right? So, but let me back up before I give investing advice, which is, the key is what you really want to do is do what my parents have done, which is they don't know anything about investing. My parents are 81 and 82 years old. Since the age of 21. So for 60 years, they've been at it. They've been teachers, educators. Neither has ever earned a high income. But every single year, to my knowledge, until their retirement at least, they have lived beneath their means. Whatever your income is, your after-tax income is you must control your expenses such that every year you spend less than you earn. And what that means is, by definition, you are saving money every year. Now, the simplest, best, most obvious way to do this is with your employer. Hopefully, you have an employer who has a retirement program, and it's automatically withdrawn from your paycheck. And to this day, even, in my, after decades, and I've achieved some wealth and so forth, to this day, this month in January, I am maxing out my maximum amount that I am allowed to set aside tax-free in my retirement account. And tax-free money is super valuable to have, much more valuable than taxable money when you compound it out over a lifetime, right? If you don't have to pay taxes on your gains every year. So it's very important that it's tax-free, but it's very important that I never see the money. It never goes into my bank account. It's withdrawn and sent over to whatever it is, my account at Fidelity or whatever. And generally, I think in all my accounts, I think I may have it should be automatically invested in the S&P 500 index fund. Now, if I want to buy a stock or something, I can sell some of the index fund and buy the stock, but the default for a person doing this is just put it in the S&P 500 index fund. Then So max out on your retirement, everything you can set aside, and hopefully your employer has a matching program for the first 3% or something like that. Now that's really free money. It's absolutely insane not to take advantage of an employer's match if you're lucky enough to have an employer that does that. But even if you don't have an employer that will do this for you, you can just set up a Roth IRA, do a little paperwork at Vanguard or Fidelity or E-Trade or something, and you can do it yourself, but it requires a little more effort. It's much easier to just have it happen automatically. So those would be the first two keys, or first three keys. One, have a steady income and don't get fired, and don't go start trying to do your own thing, selling Herbalife shakes or other nonsense that people get sucked into. Get a good job, build a good stable career, and get a spouse who also has a good stable career. So you have two incomes every year. That's what my parents did for 60 years. Okay. Then secondly, they controlled their expenses such they were net savers every single year for 60 years. And then thirdly, have that net savings automatically taken out of your paycheck so you never see it, and have the maximum put into your retirement accounts every year. And then ideally, there's more savings than that, in which case you just set up a taxable account somewhere. And so you understand all the things I've just said have nothing to do with investing. You don't need to be a good stock picker. You don't need to find the next Bitcoin or whatever, So the last piece of it, and the least important piece of achieving long-term wealth, is how you invest that money that you've now set aside every year. And that's where I'll return to what I was saying earlier, which I shouldn't have led with, because it's actually the least important part of it. But the key there is just don't blow yourself up and do something stupid, right? That's the most important thing. And the easiest way to do that is again, don't even look at it. Just have it automatically rolled into the S&P 500. And as if it's in your long-term account, you're not going to need it anytime soon. Just leave it there and ignore the stock market and let the stock market go up and down. Turn off the CNBC and whatever. So at that point, to the extent that you want to try and do a little better than the market and you enjoy investing and all, at that point, maybe sign up for one of my newsletters, and I'll try and give you my best advice and a good stock idea every month in each of my newsletters, right? I'll put in a little plug here for my
go ahead,
business.
do it.
But I'm telling you, this is the very least important thing. And you can live a long and happy life like my parents for 61 years of savings, and they've now accumulated, never ever once having had any big payday, any big inheritance, anything. Just as teachers, basically, and educators, they have accumulated a multi-million-dollar nest egg. And that's solely the power of compounding. Me putting them in the S&P 500 25 years ago when they moved over to Africa and I took over their financial accounts and they were sitting mostly in cash. I said, that's silly. You shouldn't, at the age of 50, you shouldn't be sitting mostly in cash. You should be sitting mostly in stocks. And so, yeah, they put some of it in my hedge fund, but most of it was just in the S&P 500. And again, they just saved and saved every year and let the power of long-term compounding work. And they never once screwed it up and did something foolish.
I love it. Well, Whitney, there's so much worldly wisdom in this conversation. Really appreciate you taking the time. Whitney Tilson, founder and CEO of Empire Financial Research and the author of the book, The Art of Playing Defense, How to Get Ahead by Not Falling Behind. Really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you so much, Whitney.
My pleasure.
Hey everyone, I really hope you enjoyed that video. Be sure to hit that like button, the subscribe, and that bell so you won't miss any new videos.